What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Dunk on AP podcast, and welcome to TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, on period 2 of APUSH. And remember that period 2 is 1607 to 1754. So 1607 it marks the starting date of this time period because that is when Jamestown gets settled. Remember that Jamestown is part of a joint stock company called the Virginia Company that is sent over by the British. The joint stock companies were extremely popular in Europe at this time because what you were able to do was minimize your investment, minimize your risk, and in a lot of ways make a whole lot of money discovering the new world. In the same way that an investor might invest in a startup company today and say, in the way that Shark Tank might invest money, joint stock companies were really a lot like that. So the Virginia Company sends Jamestown over. Now, Jamestown is really in some ways successful, but in some ways kind of a catastrophic failure. It is saved from total starvation and total death, because there was already a lot of that stuff, but it's saved from a total catastrophe because of John Rolfe, one of the settlers, bringing over tobacco, okay? And that actually grows extremely well in Virginia, and that is going to save that colony from economic ruin and literal ruin. So while Jamestown is not the most unbelievably successful colony, it does get Britain's foot in the door in the Americas. Now, from there, Britain is going to establish 13 colonies. Less than you need to know specifically each of those 13 colonies and why they settled. My recommendation, of course, is knowing the general regions, how they lived, how they governed themselves, and why they settled there. So let's start with the South. Generally, the south of the 13 colonies, the southern colonies, is going to be profit-seeking ventures, okay? They are mostly there for the sake of making money, much in the way that Spain kind of has complicated reasons. Remember the 3 G's for Spain: God, gold, and glory. In the South, it's less religious and more economic. They're going to survive on big plantation farms. They're also going to be governed you're going to have different methods. But remember, notably, John Smith governs the Jamestown colony with a very firm hand, famously stating, "He who does not work shall not eat." Religiously, they're not quite as strict, particularly as the New England colonies, but almost nobody is. We'll get to them in here in just a second. So in the South, you've got very, very fertile ground, and you're going to see that they are largely agricultural. The tip of these southern colonies is sometimes referred to individually as the Chesapeake colonies. That's Virginia and Maryland, and these are sort of the jewel in the crown of the 13 colonies if you are Britain. Now, moving to the middle colonies, like modern-day New York, New Jersey, places like that, they are built much more on cereal crops, and they are built much more on trade because the ground is not quite as good for agriculture there as it is in the South. So you're going to have a lot more trading ports there. They're going to be a lot more religiously tolerant. You're going to have Pennsylvania that is extremely religiously tolerant, but remember that Pennsylvania is religiously tolerant because it's founded by Quakers, a guy named William Penn, but religiously tolerant means something different then than it does now. It basically meant we will allow you to be whatever sort of Christian you wish to be, rather than, hey, come in here and do other stuff like that. So the middle colonies, you're going to have much more. You're going to have elected officials and stuff like that. But they're going to be a little bit more religiously tolerant. Now, in New England, the New England colonies, this is going to be the most strict religiously. Remember that is a big reason why most of the New England colonies came here. Notably, the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, they came for the sake of religious liberty. So you're going to see much more strict. You're going to see if you want to have a voice, you need to be a church leader. Notably, Anne Hutchinson speaks, sort of takes on what would traditionally be a man's role and in one of these colonies, and she actually is going to get exiled because she was teaching the Bible as though she were a man. And so that's a pretty big deal there. Now, with these 13 colonies, and remember that, with the New England colonies, they were not necessarily, the ground is not nearly as fertile there as it is in the South or even in the middle colonies. So you had much more small family farms because the land is not as good. You also have the Mayflower Compact. It's one of the early governing documents. You have the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It's one of the early governing documents. So period 2 is all about these guys are over on the other side of the world. How do they survive and how do they govern themselves? A couple more notable things that happen One, in 1587, you get Bacon's Rebellion. That is in Virginia. That is where the indentured servants that had been coming over, because remember, there are all of this land, particularly in the South, it's agriculture intensive. You need people to work it. So you've got indentured servants coming over who would work for a time, and they will, once their time is served, they will get some liberty. They will get their own, their own patch of land and all that good stuff. But 1587, the people of Virginia, the newly freed indentured servants, don't feel that they are being protected by the British Crown or by the governor of Virginia, a guy named William Berkeley, because whenever they move west, the natives are really, really mad about it, which, understandable. As they do, so they get really, really upset, and they actually burn down Jamestown. And what's going to happen is that with Bacon's Rebellion, which is eventually put down, by the way, the British Crown is going to say, man, this whole importing indentured servants thing is a lot more tricky than maybe if we were to just import African slaves. So what is going to happen is you get a massive boost in the transatlantic slave trade after Bacon's Rebellion. So that's a big thing that happens. Another thing that happens in the 1720s and 1730s is the First Great Awakening. Not to be confused with the Second Great Awakening. No, they are not the same thing. No, we are not there yet. The First Great Awakening, in which you are going to see the 13 colonies experiencing a revival. A guy named George Whitefield and a guy named Jonathan Edwards are sort of the two catalyst preachers of that. But what is going to happen is there's going to be a great movement of the Holy Spirit that unites the 13 colonies under a common umbrella of they are very, very far apart from each other, and they are very disjointed because there's no communication technology at this time other than letters and things like that. And even then, it's going to be really hard because there's not a ton of travel infrastructure. So George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards unite the country through the preaching of the gospel. But also you have Enlightenment ideals coming over from Europe at this time, and both of these things are actually, they're kind of doing opposite things. The Enlightenment is telling people, hey, you need to be less reliant on the Christian God and more reliant on what you sense and more reliant on science and things like that. And of course, you've got guys like John Locke who are talking about life, liberty, and property, and that's going to spill over very, very much into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all that good stuff. But on the Great Awakening, they're saying you need to be more reliant on God. The common denominator there is that each side is saying you don't need to rely on the government to tell you how you should live. And that is going to cause the 13 colonies to get very, very, shall we say, less than intrigued by the prospect of British rule, particularly when they are being taxed for things over which they have no say. Notably, Britain is fighting a lot of wars at this time, mostly against the French, but also, they've got all kinds of irons in the colonial fire. And they have been practicing a policy called salutary neglect toward the colonies. That policy of salutary neglect, which is basically, hey, we're going to let you run yourselves, just, make sure you give us our cut, that is going to end with the French and Indian War, also known as the also known as the 7 Years' War, not the Spanish-American War. But that's next period. See you next time.